Erev Tov Rabotai, we're continuing with our Mishna Yomi, Mesechet Sheviit. We're up to Perek Vav, Mishnah Vav. Today's Mishnah should be Leilu Nishmat, Neria ben Svetlana Aranbai, Menuchato Began Eden, Amen. As an introduction, Rabotai, according to the law of the Torah, the obligation to separate Terumot and Maasrot applies only to produce that grew in Eretz Yisrael. The Chachamim, however, extended the obligation to include produce of certain countries that are near Eretz Yisrael, namely Babylonia, Egypt, Amnon, Moab, and Syria. The Mishnah now is going to discuss importing terumah from these lands into Eretz Yisrael. The Mishnah says, "En mivi'in terumah mechutz la'aretz la'aretz." We may not import terumah from outside the land of Israel into the land of Israel, because if this were allowed, Kohanim might leave Eretz Yisrael to obtain terumah. What does that mean? If a person was allowed to bring terumah into Eretz Yisrael from other countries, Kohanim might leave Eretz Yisrael to get terumah and bring it back with them. And the Mefarshim explain they would violate the general Isur against any Jew, whether he's a Kohen or not, from leaving Eretz Yisrael. The rabbis therefore decreed that terumah cannot be imported into Eretz Yisrael from other countries. This would discourage Kohanim from leaving Eretz Yisrael to obtain terumah, because if they cannot bring it back with them, they would not go to get it in the first place. Amar Rabbi Shimon says, Shamati beferush mivin misuria ven mivin chutz la'aretz. I heard explicitly that we can import terumah into the land of Israel from Syria, but we cannot import terumah into the land of Israel from other places outside the land, because again, Rabbi Shimon holds that Syria is part of Eretz Yisrael, so you're not leaving Eretz Yisrael. But the Rab tells us, En halacha ke Rabbi Shimon, the halacha does not follow Rabbi Shimon. That is in Rabotai Mishnah Vav and Perek Vav. Perek Zayin Mishnah Aleph, Rabotai, is an introduction. We learned that produce of the Shemitah year has sanctity, meaning it's required to be treated in a special way. It has to be eaten or consumed in a food-like manner. It cannot be wasted or used for business purposes, because the Torah says, Vaita Shabbat ha'aretz lechem le'ochla. The uncultivated produce of the land shall be for you to eat, meaning that Shemitah produce can only be used for eating and not for anything else. It can be used for eating and other similar activities to eating, but not anything else like business or wasting it. It must be left for all to take. It cannot be guarded by the owner of the field in which it grew. Also, most Shemitah produce requires bi'ur, which we said the removal, which we said many times the process of bi'ur is performed when each species of produce is no longer available in the field for wild animals to eat. At that point, anyone who has any of that species in his house must give up his rights of ownership in it and put it outside his house for anyone to take. However, not everything that has Shemitah sanctity is subject to bi'ur. This Mishnah is going to deal with produce that has Shemitah sanctity and requires bi'ur. The next Mishnah, in tomorrow's Mishnah, is going to speak about produce that has Shemitah sanctity but does not require bi'ur. So the Mishnah says, Klal gadol amru b'shvit. The Chachamim said a major rule regarding Shemitah. Kol shu ma'achal adam u'ma'achal be'ema u'mimin hatzovim. Any produce that is food for people or food for animals or a species used for dyeing for the colors, then umitkem ba'aretz, and it does not last in the ground, meaning it rots if it's left in the ground for a long time. And the Mefarshim explain that the commentaries have different definitions. They discuss what does it mean does not last in the ground. According to one opinion, it means that the species rot in the ground before the end of the 8th year. Now, this condition of that it does not last in the ground, it's not required for produce to have Shemitah sanctity. It's only listed here because of the relevance to the laws of bi'ur. When a species is no longer available in the fields for animals to eat, a person has to perform bi'ur. Therefore, a species that lasts in the ground for a long time is exempt from bi'ur. Why? Because it's available for animals to eat for so long, right? To animals to eat for so long. Bi'ur is needed only for those types of produce that does not last in the ground, right? Yesh lo Sheviit u'damav Sheviit. So, any produce that is food for people or food for animals or species used for dyeing and it does not last in the ground, it has yesh lo Sheviit, it has Shemitah sanctity, and if it's sold u'damav Sheviit, and if it's sold, the money received for it has Shemitah sanctity. Yesh lo Sheviit u'damav Sheviit. The produce itself has Shemitah sanctity, and if it's sold, the money you received for it has Shemitah sanctity. What does that mean? We know produce that people eat has Shemitah sanctity, like the Pasuk says, right? Vaita Shabbat ha'aretz lechem le'ochla. The uncultivated produce of the land shall be for you to eat, right? Produce that animals eat is also sacred. like the pasuk, in the next pasuk it says, and for your animals and for the beast that is in your land shall all its produce be to eat. The Chachamim learned from the words for you in the first pasuk, lachem leochla, that Shemitah sanctity applies even to produce that is used only for activities that merely resemble eating, meaning when one eats, the food is destroyed at the same time that it provides benefit. Therefore, any plants that share this characteristic are treated like food and have Shemitah sanctity, meaning included in this category are items that use for dyeing, because the dyeing stuff is consumed at the same time that it is that it colors the fabric. Therefore, it's part of this category as well. It has Shemitah sanctity. Now, what does it mean the money that you received for it has Shemitah sanctity? For example, if a person sells Shemitah produce, which in certain cases you are allowed to do, the money that he gets from the sale becomes sacred just like the produce itself. Meaning, just like in the case of Shemitah produce, you cannot waste the money or use it for business purposes. Instead, you have to use it to buy food. Instead, so too by the money, you have to use it to buy food, and the sanctity of the money is thereby transferred to the purchased food. Just like by Shemitah food, you can only use to eat and not for business purposes. Same thing in the money, you can only use for eating and not for business purposes, and the sanctity of the money will go on to the food that you bought. The Mishnah continues, Yesh lo bi'ur dama bi'ur. It is subject to the requirement of bi'ur because it eventually rots and it becomes unavailable for the wild animals to eat. And if it is sold, the money that you received for it also becomes subject to the obligation of bi'ur. What does that mean? For example, if you sold pomegranates, the money that you received is subject to bi'ur, just like the pomegranates. Meaning, when pomegranates are no longer found on the trees in the field, any money that remains from the sale must be removed from his house. The Rambam speaks about these halachot in his Hilchot Shemitah, chapter 6 and chapter 7. Now, the Mishnah discusses each of these three categories that just listed, right? Food for people that does not last in the ground, food for animals that does not last in the ground, and species used for dyeing that does not last in the ground, right? It starts by teaching that certain plants are considered food for humans, even though people rarely eat them. Ve'ezeh, which types of produce are examples for these things? Ze Allah halufa shoteh. The first category, which is human food that does not last in the ground, includes the leaf of a wild loof. If you remember, loof, we said either as Rav says it's onion or Rash says it's a type of bean plant. It includes the leaf of a wild loof, which even though it's bitter, can be eaten by being sweetened. Now, the wild loof that we mentioned in our Mishnah here is an inferior variety of loof that is not deliberately grown by people. Nobody grows it on purpose because the leaves are bitter, therefore it grows in the wild, right? The Mishnah is telling us even though the leaf of this variety of loof is not edible until it's sweetened, it is considered a food and still has Shemitah sanctity. Va'aleh hadandana, the leaf of mint, ha'ulshin, va'kreshin, endives and leeks that are wild, which are eaten when the garden varieties are unavailable. The Mifashim explain both endives and leeks are found in two varieties: the commonly grown garden variety and the wild variety. In ordinary non-Shemitah years, when the garden varieties are readily available, the wild types are not eaten at all, and therefore they're not considered food. But during Shemitah, when planting is asur and the garden varieties cannot be found, the wild varieties are used instead, and therefore they have Shemitah sanctity, right? Ha'ushin va'kreshin, endives and leeks that are wild, which are eaten when the garden varieties are unavailable. V'halgila, the purslane, which is a type of herb with edible leaves. V'netzeh chalav, and the milky blossom, which is a plant with flowers as white as milk. Even though they are not frequently eaten, they are eaten often enough to be considered food, so they have Shemitah sanctity. Now the Mishnah moves on to the second and third categories, right? The animal food and the dye materials. Uma'achal be'ema achochim v'dardarim. Plants used for animal food that do not last in the ground include soft thorns and thistles, right? The Mifashim explain, obviously we're talking about soft thorns and thistles that are fit for animal consumption. Now, even though they are an inferior food for animals, the Mishnah says they are still considered animal food regarding Shemitah sanctity. Umimina tzovim sifiche isatis v'kotza. Species used for making dye that do not last in the ground include aftergrowths, sifiche is aftergrowths of isatis and safflower. Isatis is a source of blue dye. Now the Mishnah calls it aftergrowths of isatis because if the root is left in the ground after the plant is cut, the same root produces new plants. Therefore, the new plants are not a result of planting, but it grew on their own like svichin, aftergrowths. Yesh lahem shviit v'lidmehen shviit. All these products have Shemitah sanctity, and the money that you receive them has Shemitah sanctity. Yesh lahem bi'u v'lidmehen bi'u. They are subject to the requirement of bi'u, and the money that you receive for them is also subject to the requirement of bi'u. Again, the Mishnah is repeating this law to make it parallel, the Mefarshim explain, to the next Mishnah, where the rule has to be restarted. So we just made this rule so you can move on right away to the next Mishnah. That is in Rabotai, today's Mishna Yomi. Baruch Adonai le'olam, amen v'amen.